This hearing will come to order. Iran and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have really been on a roll, and that's the subject of this hearing today. And I want to thank our witnesses for being with us. Let me start by just giving my observations on recent events. So over the last few weeks, the IRGC has tested a new long-range ballistic missile, and that test is in violation of the UN sanctions. They also released a video of dozens more of these ICBMs staged in an underground bunker. The IRGC's Quds Force has stepped up efforts in support of the murderous Assad regime in Syria, and we've seen those attacks on the ground. And by all accounts, it appears that the IRGC has prevented international investigators from assessing the information needed to conclusively finish a report on the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. It's on IRGC territory. So, from nuclear proliferation to support of international terrorism to human rights abuses, the IRGC has made Iran the global menace that Iran is today. The IRGC is responsible for squashing democracy movements at home, for spreading the Iranian regime's revolutionary ideology abroad, and for sparking turmoil throughout the Middle East. Its forces operate, again, independent of Iran's regular army. It answers directly only to one man, Iran's supreme leader. While most understand the role of the IRGC in fueling conflict throughout the region, its hidden grasp on the Iranian economy is just as important. People don't realize that most of the major businesses were nationalized, basically, and turned over to the IRGC to control. So they have about 30% of the Iranian economy. So the IRGC has been labeled Iran's most powerful economic actor by the U.S. Treasury Department, which has noted its deep reach into critical sectors of Iran's economic infrastructure. The IRGC's biggest, largest entity is this construction arm, which controls 800 affiliated companies, that it also controls billions of assets, is often, I think, lost on the public here. The fact that much of the money that's held in escrow, that when released is going to flow through the IRGC. I think that point has been lost on us. These activities, in turn, fund Iran's ballistic missile program, its military activities, its regional aggression. And of course, none of this appears to disqualify Iran from receiving sanctions relief under a nuclear deal that allows Iran to keep a path to a weapon. Within months, Iran could have access to tens of billions in new cash as this money comes out of escrow. And this, what I'd call a stimulus package, this stimulus package for the Supreme Leader will only strengthen the IRGC. And as trade restrictions with Iran loosens, that in turn, of course, will increase its access to dual-use technology for its military and its missile programs. An IRGC with more cash means more threats to the United States and our allies. Even when Iran sanctions were fully in place, Iran's support to the Assad regime in Syria totaled every year $6 billion. I'm going to guess now that that's going to go up. IRGC support on the ground, combined with Russian air support, worsened the already horrible conflict in Syria, drawing in foreign fighters and giving ISIS room to grow. And more resources for the IRGC also promises to create problems in Iraq and in Yemen, where the guards are backing Shia militias responsible for violence against Iraq's Sunni minority and against the Houthi rebels fighting Saudi forces in Yemen. This, combined with Iran's continued support for terrorist groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and I'll just remind people that the other story that surfaced a few months ago was that the IRGC will now try to transfer and I think this is in direct violation of the agreement, try to transfer guidance systems, GPS guidance systems, to the 90,000 rockets and missiles that are already in Hezbollah's inventory, and has also offered to resupply the inventory that Hamas spent in the Gaza war, and rebuild the tunnels to boot. So the major source of instability in that region is the IRGC. And in selling its flawed nuclear deal to Congress, I believe Secretary Kerry testified that there would be no let-up on Iran's terror and destructive regional behavior. That was my takeaway as I listened to his words, but I want to now understand how that's going to be followed with action. We have yet to see any effective strategy from the administration to push back against IRGC's regional advances, which have emboldened Iran, which have undermined our allies, and this morning we'll hear from our witnesses on what such a strategy might look like and how Congress can help. And I'll now turn to the ranking member for any open comments he may have. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing, and I want to welcome our witnesses to the Foreign Affairs Committee. In the wake of the Paris attacks, the world is focused on the fight against ISIS. Announcements yesterday by the Secretary of Defense. It's not working. This is what happened last time. Okay, and now that's better. So announcements yesterday by the Secretary of Defense about new measures that we're taking to fight ISIS are welcomed, and I think that there is obviously a lot more to go. We are reminded of the ongoing threat posed by terrorism, and so I'm glad our committee is focusing on the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. I want to echo the concerns that the chairman just mentioned, the fact that Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism, and in the past several years, when Iran had no money, it still found money to be the leading state sponsor of terrorism. Under the deal negotiated with Iran, they will be awash in cash. They will have lots of money. And imagine how much destruction they can do in support of terrorist activities and terrorism. That's very deeply troubling for me, and it was and has been throughout our discussions about U.S. relations with Iran and the entire nuclear deal with Iran. Now, since seizing power in 1979, the Iranian regime has built an ugly record supporting terrorist proxies. Let's remember this. The seizure of our embassy in Tehran, 1979. The bombings of our embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut in the early 80s, killing nearly 300 Americans. The attacks in Buenos Aires that targeted Israel's embassy and a Jewish community center. The Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, which also cost American lives. And just a few years ago, a plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador right here in Washington. And every one of these horrible events is covered in Iran's fingerprints. The Iranian regime uses the Quds Force, an elite unit of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a tool to support terrorist proxies and spread instability throughout the region. And in recent years, Iran's leaders have doubled down on this reprehensible policy. And let's just look at what's going on today. In Syria, Iran is committed to propping up the Assad regime and now is working with Putin in pursuit of that objective. So much for P5+1. It has mobilized Hezbollah, an organized militias composed of Shiite fighters from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to support the regime. It has also deployed hundreds, if not thousands, of the Quds Force fighters in a direct combat role. And the result of Iran's actions, a longer, more costly war, a graver humanitarian crisis, and more innocent lives lost. In Iraq, the Quds Force continues to support hardcore Shia militias, some of which were involved in targeting American troops during the Iraq War. These violent groups drive sectarian division, making it harder to build the inclusive Iraqi government necessary to help defeat ISIS. And in Yemen, Iran's support for Houthi rebels has fomented a bloody civil war that's now spilling over Yemen's borders. The chaos in that country has hampered U.S. counterterrorism efforts focused on AQAP, one of the most dangerous al-Qaeda affiliates. Iran also supports Shiite elements in other Gulf states, including Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that are involved in efforts to destabilize those governments. And of course, the Iranian regime has repeatedly expressed its support for wiping Israel off the map by providing a steady flow of missiles to Hezbollah and arms to Hamas. Iran is a grave threat to our close ally Israel. Finally, it's important to note that Iran's support for terrorism is not just limited to the Middle East. Just this past week, Kenyan security forces arrested 2 men suspected of working with the Quds Force to plan attacks in that East African nation. This dangerous pattern is one of the reasons I remain concerned about the Iran nuclear deal. Once the nuclear sanctions on Iran are lifted, the regime will have access to tens of billions of dollars in new wealth, and I'll bet my money that some of it will end up in terrorist coffers. So I agree with what the chairman said. Iran was a leading and has been a leading state sponsor of terrorism when they had no money. Imagine now when they're going to have sanctions listed, how much money they have, which will directly go to terrorist activities. So in my view, these factors all point to the likelihood of greater chaos and instability in the years ahead. So today I hope we can discuss what can be done to counter Iran's malign activities in the region and beyond. I want to mention just a few areas I think are most important. First, we must aggressively enforce terrorism, proliferation, and human rights sanctions on Iran. This includes existing sanctions on the IRGC, and we should continue to designate all entities connected to Iran's support for terrorism. We need to send a clear message that working with Iranian firms linked to the IRGC is risky business. Next, we need to keep making our case to our EU allies and others that Hezbollah, as an organization, not just its military wing, is a terrorist organization and should be treated like a terrorist organization. Our friends in Europe try to split hairs by saying that only part of Hamas is a terrorist organization. The other part is a humanitarian organization. Baloney. It's a terrorist organization, and we should say it, and our allies should say it. We should ramp up our efforts to track the resources Iran receives as a result of sanctions relief. We need to know just how much money Iran is funneling to those violent groups. We need closer cooperation with our Gulf allies on defense, intelligence, counterterrorism, maritime security, and other key areas. And lastly, we need to maintain a very close security relationship with Israel, our closest ally in the region. This includes the negotiation of a new Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, that reflects the new security environment in the region. We must also redouble our commitment to supporting missile defense systems, including Iron Dome, so that Israel is able to defend itself. And I hope going forward, Congress and the administration do what's needed to pursue those aims. I look forward to ideas and insight from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So this morning, we're joined by a distinguished panel. We have Mr. Ali Al-Faneh. He is the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He's an expert on civil-military relations in Iran, as well as the author of Iran Unveiled: How the Revolutionary Guard is Transforming Iran from a Theocracy into a Military Dictatorship. Mr. Scott Modell is Managing Director of the Rayburn Group, and prior to this, he served at the Central Intelligence Agency, where he conducted operations throughout the Middle East, including as part of the post-9/11 operations in Afghanistan. And we have Ambassador Daniel Benjamin with us. He's the Norman E. McCulloch Director at Dartmouth College. Previously, Ambassador Benjamin served as the Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism, where he was the principal advisor on counterterrorism to Secretary of State Clinton. And we welcome our panel, and without objection, the witness's full prepared statement will be made part of the record here, and members will have 5 days to submit statements or questions or any extraneous materials for the record. And Mr. Al-Faneh, please summarize your remarks.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel. Thank you very much for your kind invitation, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to share my analysis with you, along with the members of this distinguished panel. You mentioned, sir, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 as a historical event of the past, and that is indeed the American perception of the revolution. In Iran, however, the leaders of the Islamic Republic, they subscribe to Trotsky's theory of a permanent revolution. For them, the revolution of 1979 is not a historical event of the past which took place and is over. From their perspective, the revolution is permanent, is happening every single day, and the engine of that revolution, Mr. Chairman, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. This is also why that I do not share the optimism of some of my colleagues here in Washington who believe that emergence of President Rouhani, his promise of engaging in bilateral talks with the US, the nuclear negotiations and the deal which was negotiated, and even emergence of a common threat of Islamic State is going to make life easier with the Islamic Republic of Iran because of the very simple reason that President Rouhani and his technocratic government, they are not in charge of the portfolios which are of interest to us today. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps is in control of Iran's regional policies. Let's take a quick look at the problems that I see. First of all, as the chairman and the ranking member pointed out, the Revolutionary Guard not only is in control of the policy, they have also benefited most financially from the nuclear deal. Much of the money which the government of the Islamic Republic has received is going to be channeled to companies owned by the Revolutionary Guards or directly to the military budget of the Revolutionary Guards. Apart from this, the Revolutionary Guards is pursuing policy objectives in the Middle East region which are in contrast and totally opposed to US objectives. The United States desires to see a future of Syria in which Bashar al-Assad, who is personally responsible for destruction of his own country, does not play a role. The Revolutionary Guard's goal is to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, and to that effect, they are trying to mobilize, and they have managed to mobilize, a pan-Shiite international brigade to Syria, and that deployment, of course, is increasing the risk of spread of the conflict in Syria to other countries, the home countries of those militiamen, which is primarily Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even distant and geographically far away Pakistan. The United States desires to fight ISIL. That is not the case with the Revolutionary Guards. From their perspective, it is fine that there is an enemy called the Islamic State, which is not really threatening the existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and at the same time is the only alternative to Bashar al-Assad and his dictatorial regime in Syria. This is why we see that the Iranian forces and unfortunately also the Russian forces in Syria are not targeting the ISIL threat, they are targeting the secular opposition to Mr. Assad. We also see that these mechanisms are perpetuating the war in Syria. Because of the exact presence of the Revolutionary Guards in Syria, we see more and more Sunni radicals from all over the world traveling to Syria to fight the Shia threats and to counter it. And this is, of course, also something which is perpetuating the conflict and keeping ISIL in its existence. It's prolonging the existence of ISIS. So some of the policies which I believe the United States could apply in order to counter those measures is first and foremost to attack those units of the Revolutionary Guards which were deployed to Syria by designations. Those groups of the Revolutionary Guards, they are engaged in support to Mr. Assad's regime. They are engaged in terrorist activities, and they should be designated as such. And also, I believe that the United States should never accept demands of the Islamic Republic of Iran or others that Mr. Bashar al-Assad should be kept in power in Syria, because that would only serve the interests of the Revolutionary Guards and will perpetuate not only the war in Syria, but also the revolution, the permanent revolution, which I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, fellow panelists, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As the Middle East continues to burn, the U.S. and its allies have numerous reasons to believe that Iran really hasn't changed all that much since President Rouhani took office in September 2013. President Rouhani was elected to rescue Iran's economy. That was his mandate, and he is on his way to achieving that. Rouhani may appear moderate next to outspoken hardliners in the IRGC, but I believe that both continue to be driven by the same revolutionary ideals that inspired the Ayatollah Khomeini to create the Islamic Republic in 1979. Rouhani has been outspoken in his disagreement with some of the methods chosen by the IRGC, but there is little that he can do, as Mr. Al-Fanesi said, to stop the IRGC. The recent unwillingness of the Obama administration to weaken the IRGC seems to me incompatible with its apparent belief that the JCPOA will strengthen moderates in Iran who favor internal reform and rapprochement with the West. I think it's worth it to look at some of the core missions of the IRGC, particularly its Quds Force in the region, some of which are not regularly mentioned, others which were mentioned by the chairman and the ranking member. In addition to some of the lethal activities that were suggested and the more destabilizing military activities that the IRGC engages in, they are heavily involved in covert influence, grassroots foundation building across the region via cultural, social, economic, political, and business organizations. And in my testimony, I've given a graphic of some of the ways in which they approach the whole of government, grassroots, bottom-up approach to building influence across countries, which is sectarian-driven. The IRGC is also working very closely with Lebanese Hezbollah to build a global commercial apparatus that is designed to acquire new technologies, assist with covert action programs, create new sources of revenue, and actually add to Iran's existing threat facilitation networks. The importance of covert action to Iran's revolutionary export strategy has been clear from day one, particularly in the last 4 years. Since May 11, there have been dozens of terrorist plots attributed to Iran, from an attempt to murder the Saudi ambassador in the U.S. to a foiled bomb plot in Kenya. Covert action continues to remain a key tool of Iranian foreign policy. The Quds Force is engaged in various non-kinetic activities, as I said. They will continue to play a role in its external resistance mission, whether it's front companies, religious foundations, cultural centers, and so on. Some of the ways in which IRGC is destabilizing the region have already been mentioned. I would like to point out a couple of things that are given less attention, I think, and that is the IRGC is part of a sectarian repopulation strategy across the region. Few people are talking about the IRGC's leading role in Iran's strategy to alter the sectarian balance across the region, beginning in the Levant. So when and where it can, Iran-sponsored militias are creating Shia support bases across Iraq and Syria, and pressuring, and even getting to the point of pressuring Sunnis and entire communities to relocate. It perpetuates Sunni distrust, hatred, and organized opposition to Iran, Iran-backed militias, and even Shiites. Bahrain is mentioned also. I think it's a particular problem. The propaganda war between Manama and Tehran continues to intensify as a result of persistent messaging on the part of Iranian hardliners that Bahrain actually belongs to Iran. The recent arrest of 36 Bahraini Shiites on charges of spying for the IRGC, the 400 or so others in prison on similar charges, and the dozens of incidents over the years almost always lead back to the IRGC. In Saudi Arabia, while President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif have made some attempt at diplomatic outreach to the Saudis, the IRGC has been on a much more confrontational path, both openly and covertly. The Saudi government continues to uncover IRGC attempts to penetrate and militarize Shia communities in its oil-rich eastern province. The IRGC's Department 1000, operating out of Basra, continues to play a key role in these and other efforts against the kingdom. I look forward to talking about some of my policy recommendations as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today about Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and more broadly the country's destabilizing behavior in the Middle East. As a prefatory note, though, I want to mention that the United States has, over recent decades, compiled a record of success in dealing with Iran. We have certainly had our losses, such as at Khobar Towers and in Beirut in 1983, but overall, our nation has, together with our partners in the region and around the world, prevented the Islamic Republic from causing far greater damage to regional stability and the security of some of our closest friends. And today I'm convinced that we are on a course to continue this success and indeed to strengthen security in the region through the JCPOA, which, if Iran fulfills its obligations, will end the country's pursuit of a nuclear weapon for at least 15 years. As President Obama has said on many occasions, this deal does not address all of Iran's behavior, nor was it intended to, but it does address one of the foremost security challenges of our time, and that is Iran's nuclear aspirations. And as we consider the other ways in which Iran challenges us, we should be mindful of the JCPOA achievement and leery of anything that would undermine it. And we should also recognize that anything that the problems we face would be without the JCPOA far more problematic if we were facing off against a nuclear-armed Iran. The charge has been made that Iran is going to get a vast influx of cash with which to carry out terrorist attacks and subversion. We certainly have well-founded fears of Iranian plotting, and we must continue to show vigilance. But the argument, I think, needs to be examined in two ways. First, how likely is it that Iran will devote massive resources to such a course? And second, to what extent does the Islamic Republic's behavior, current behavior, represent a continuation of earlier conduct? It seems to me that the hypothesis is flawed in two ways, in several ways, excuse me. First, the Iranian leadership's goal in negotiating the JCPOA was to improve economic conditions at home that were eroding support for the regime. So much seems clear from the rhetoric and the behavior of Iran's leaders. It would follow, therefore, that the bulk of the money will be used to ameliorate domestic concerns. According to press reports, the U.S. intelligence community has arrived at the same conclusion. And I would add here that Iran usually makes rational calculations about advancing its interests, and having invested the time, energy, and political capital in the JCPOA, it is undoubtedly aware that a new and enhanced campaign of terrorism or subversion would risk scuttling the agreement. Second, as has been mentioned before, the country has never restricted resources for its foreign policy, especially not for such activities as its direct support to the Assad regime and Iranians fighting in Syria. I think it is that suggests that it considers those areas to be well funded. It's unlikely to spend vast new sums. It will certainly continue pouring money into those activities. But it's also important to remember that terrorism and subversion are inexpensive activities, and we've learned that through hard experience. Iran, of course, remains by a significant margin the foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and we have seen no indication that there's been any change in the belief that terrorism is a legitimate instrument of policy. But what I would like to note is that, to pick up on what Mr. Modell was saying, the sectarian dimension of all this requires an awful lot of attention. And I would suggest that the situation that we confront today is far different from one that we have seen in the past. And I think that it's one that we really need to examine closely. Whether we're talking about what's going on in Yemen, in Bahrain, in Syria, these reflect dynamics in the region that have changed dramatically. And it's important to recognize also that the trigger for sharpening and revival of sectarian tensions was our invasion of Iraq, which destroyed the region's fragile equilibrium and upended the regional politics, and that the second trigger was the Arab Spring, which opened up a new opportunity in Syria for Sunnis to even the score, having lost the capital in Baghdad. There's a lot more to say, but I want to close my remarks by saying that I don't think there's any expectation that Iran is going to be a good global citizen, but I think that the United States is well postured to deter and to prevent increased subversive and terrorist actions through a raft of different sanctions regimes, both as well as UN Security Council resolutions that enable all kinds of actions to constrain Iran. And I think that we are in a good position to manage the problems that we face. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me go to a question that I think impacted all of us back in October. October 15th, you had the missile launch the most advanced missile yet in the IRGC's inventory. 2 months later, there's still been no action in the wake of that test, which I think clearly violated United Nations Security Council Resolution 2331. So, Mr. Moto, if I could ask you here about next steps, because given that the EU sanctions are going to be lifted against the traditional home of their ballistic missile programs, which is the IRGC Air Force at their Ghadar Missile Command, what are the chances that the administration will actually implement sanctions against Iran for this advancement in its ballistic missile program?
I don't see any indications that there's a good chance that the Obama administration is going to take any punitive actions with regard to this ballistic missile launch. It was clearly in violation of UN Security Council 1929 and the updated resolution, as you said. I think it's worth pointing out that the IRGC's aerospace force has not gotten a lot of attention when you look at the IRGC's role in externalizing its revolution throughout the region. And if you look at the development of Iran's missiles, it's been a key part of their conventional military buildup over the last 20 years, particularly since the end of the Iran-Iraq War. They believe it's goes hand in hand with their idea of self-sufficiency in promoting the revolution. And I think when you look at the pace at which they're developing new missiles, the pace at which they're trying to use precision-guided technology, not only in the missiles that you mentioned that are going into the hands of Hezbollah and Palestinians that could be used against Israel, but throughout the region, I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Let me change directions then,
Sure.
because obviously with the IRGC being the most powerful economic actor in the equation there in the government in Iran, what's the risk of any company looking at re-entering the Iranian market from major Asian firms in Japan or South Korea with U.S. exposure to small companies in Eastern Germany? What's the risk of doing business with the IRGC?
One of the things I would say that it was mentioned, I'm glad it was mentioned, that is that companies going back, particularly European companies going back into Iran, should be well advised to look at the fact that the IRGC has not gone away, and the IRGC has deeply penetrated every corner of every industry in Iran for the most part. And I think that one of the things that needs to be talked more about is the fact that IRGC-linked companies and businesses have already started the process of hiding their IRGC links in anticipation of trying to get into business deals with European companies and Asian companies and others who are going to be re-entering Iran. There is a process underway among IRGC individuals and entities that are sanctioned to ensconce themselves in companies that are clean, in business deals that are clean. So that means erasing old contracts, erasing records and business registries and different things. So I think it's a very dangerous proposition for any company going back into Iran not knowing exactly who they're going to be dealing with. The other issue, Mr. Chairman, that I would mention is over the last decade, you've seen a terrible problem in the growth of corruption in Iran. So if you believe that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act should be any deterrent for companies going back in, again, Oil Minister Zanganeh 2 days ago at the launch of a global meeting to talk about the reemergence of Iran's oil and gas industry, had to go out of his way to say any companies doing business within Iran who are asked to pay bribes, those contracts will be null and void. He had to go out of his way because it's a tremendous problem, and the IRGC is at the heart of that problem. So what I would advise companies going back in Iran, one thing, what has emerged is there are a number of data analytic firms here in D.C. and elsewhere that are specializing in due diligence. So the idea of enhanced know your customer measures that will need to be taken for anybody going back into Iran will require outside support.
Let me ask Mr. Alfaneh the last question here, and that goes to the two goals that you talked about in your testimony that they're seeking in Iran. First, they're working to keep Bashar al-Assad in power by coordinating Shiite militias to maintain control over western Syria. By the way, I would add to that something that Mr. Moto mentioned in his testimony, but I've been briefed on the fact that they're even bringing in militia from Hezbollah and their families into Sunni-dominated neighborhoods in Damascus and running, you know, the Sunni population out as they basically do an ethnic cleansing campaign. But that's part of it. And secondarily, you said they are combating secular opposition in Syria while maintaining ISIS as a worse alternative to al-Assad. Can you explain how the IRGC is accomplishing that dual mission?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. If we look at the combat fatalities of the Revolutionary Guards in Syria, we see that the place of death is usually the places which have been bombed by the Russian Air Force. So in other words, the Revolutionary Guards is in practice acting as the infantry force, the ground force of Russia. And we also know from US government sources that Russia is not bombing the Islamic State. Russia is bombing the secular opposition to Bashar al-Assad's regime. And then after Russia has bombed those specific areas, we see an influx of Revolutionary Guards members going into those areas. And there are also, their place of death is reported in those exact areas. So unfortunately, this is a very, very cynical strategy that the Assad regime and the Revolutionary Guards are pursuing in combination. Concerning your question about your comment about the role of the Revolutionary Guards in the economy, Mr. Model is absolutely right. If you look at the assets of the Revolutionary Guards on Tehran Stock Exchange, it is more than $17 billion worth of companies registered on Tehran Stock Exchange that the Revolutionary Guards has purchased during the time that the government of President Ahmadinejad was privatizing these companies. So the Revolutionary Guards claims that its front companies are private sector actors, and they do not belong to the public sector. This is why they were allowed to bid for ownership of those companies, and they purchased those companies on Tehran Stock Exchange. Just to mention one example, Iran Telecommunication, which is the largest phone company in Iran, was purchased by the Revolutionary Guards in 2009 for $7 billion. Back then, in 2009, the military budget of the Revolutionary Guards on an annual basis was only $5 billion. But they could pay for the company, the phone company, $7 billion cash because of all the other economic activities that they have.
I assume that makes it easier for the IRGC to monitor citizens' communications as well. We'll go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for excellent testimony. Ambassador Benjamin, I agree with you when you said that the invasion of Iraq really changed, upset the apple cart, and really, in hindsight, we eliminated Iran's major adversary. Therefore, we helped, unfortunately, to make Iran the hegemonic power in the region, and I think that's very, very true. But I couldn't disagree with you more when you say that the fact that Iran has been the leading state sponsor of terrorism when they had no money doesn't necessarily mean that now that they have money, they will continue or increase their terrorist activities. I think that logic says that if the goal of the Iranian regime, the Revolutionary Guards and the entire regime, is to sponsor terrorism, to destabilize the region, now that they have money and it's not going to be a sacrifice, they're going to use it for terrorism. When the real was their currency was in the toilet, when their people clamored for more freedoms or for things that they needed, Iran, the government, the regime didn't care. The regime made sure, though, that groups like Hezbollah and even Hamas, which of course is the other side of the Sunni-Shia spectrum, had enough money. So now that Iran has money and it's not going to be so painful, I think that it's very easy to imagine, and it's not imagination, that they will have more money to support more terrorism. And finally, we talk about you had mentioned the Security Council resolutions. I don't think that Iran cares about Security Council resolutions. They had a resolution had been passed by the Security Council, which demanded, I think there were 6 or 7 or 5 resolutions, that Iran stop spinning centrifuges, that Iran not stop spinning. And one of the problems I had with the negotiations with Iran is that we didn't make a precondition of our sitting down with them and talking with them that they stop spinning. And once we didn't demand that as a prerequisite to sit down with them, you knew that in the conclusion of any agreement we had with them, the demand that they stop spinning, as the Security Council resolution said, would not be a final decision in any kind of agreement. So I think we essentially ceded that. I just want to, mention this because, members here were very thoughtful, and some voted no and some voted yes. I voted no. I respect every member's thoughtfulness, but I think that what really bothers me is I think that we have almost stamped the fact that the Iranian regime is going to be there for a long time to come. We have helped them. We have given them all kinds of relief, and any hope we had of regime change so the Iranian people could live in a democracy, I think went out the window, because frankly regimes that have lots of money are able to use it. So I just wanted to point that out, and if you care to answer, I'd be grateful.
Mr. Engel, you've put a lot of issues on the table. Let me just try to answer a few of them quickly. You mentioned your skepticism about Security Council resolutions. Well, the issue is not what Iran thinks of them. It is that they empower the international community to take certain actions. And so, for example, at the end of September, a weapons shipment from Iran to Yemen was seized on the high seas under the provisions of relevant Security Council resolutions. So the point is, we can have an effect, a real material concrete effect on Iran's ability to play the kind of role that everyone here deplores because of those instruments. You mentioned the money issue. So I think that there's a few things to say. One is that there's basically an absorption issue. There's just not that many different things to spend the money on. They've been spending lots of money on these activities for a long time. They will pour more in. I expect to see that more resources will make their way in particular to Syria. And by the way, although we all deplore what is going on in Syria, I think it's important to remember that Iran's policy there is fundamentally a conservative one. They're trying to preserve the status quo, trying to preserve their one important ally in the international community. So I do think that, I'm sorry?
I might say they're trying to preserve it, and in trying to preserve it, they're using a terrorist group, Hezbollah, to do the fighting and to guarantee that they can preserve it. So that's another element of support for
without a doubt, and they've been funding Hezbollah at a very significant rate for many, many years, and I don't dispute that in any way. I'm just saying that, first of all, one of the main constraints has been manpower and not money, and you don't need $50 billion to continue to fund your terrorism or subversive activities. I do find it hard to imagine why Iran would make a quantum leap in its provocative behavior if that would throw into doubt the future of the agreement that they worked so hard to get. I think that the Iranian leadership definitely saw that their position was eroding as a result of public discontent. We could have, and so I think that those resources will primarily, although not exclusively, go to ameliorate social conditions and to restart the economy. I would just also point out, because several people have mentioned Hamas, that Hamas has been essentially cut off by Iran because Hamas refused to support Iran's policy towards Syria. And I think that this is an absolutely perfect illustration of how the sectarian upheaval in the region has changed the rules of the game. And we should remember that King Salman, the new king of Saudi Arabia, didn't find time to come to the United States for a meeting at Camp David with President Obama, but he did have time to entertain a Hamas delegation in the hope of bringing Hamas under the Saudi wing. So things are in dramatic flux. And I think we need to think very hard and fast about what America's role is in the context of this sectarian conflict. Finally, just on the issue of IRGC benefits from the deal, you know, it's gone unmentioned that there's still a raft of U.S. Unilateral sanctions on IRGC, Treasury sanctions, which, if we want, can have secondary effects, and which are levied against IRGC for terrorism, for proliferation, for human rights violations, and the like. So, and I do believe that actually companies around the world recognize that we have these sanctions, that we may reassert them in a stronger sense, that is in a secondary sense, and therefore they're going to be cautious about getting involved with IRGC-dominated entities. Thank you.
I just want to ask one quick question to anybody who would care to answer. We've seen some recent reports that have been unconfirmed that the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani, was severely injured in Syria. Have any of you heard that? You have any confirmation or lack of?
Sir, we only have heard the rumors, but he seems to be alive. And of course, the Islamic Republic propaganda machinery is trying constantly to communicate the message that Major General Soleimani is still alive. So there is no news of the contrary, and certainly not proof.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So we go to Eliana Ross-Layton in Florida.
Thank you so much. Excellent hearing, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Well, as we've heard, and I agree with the Chairman and the Ranking Member, the administration downplays concerns that Iran will use the sanctions relief it gets from the nuclear deal for its terror activities, instead arguing that the money will be used to shore up a failing Iranian economy. But as we've heard, the IRGC is one of the major actors in the Iranian economy, with a presence in nearly every sector. It has a particularly large presence in the same sectors that the administration is arguing that sanctions relief will go to: construction, infrastructure, energy, finance. The administration is telling only one small part of the story, and that we've only scratched the surface of what we should be sanctioning, including designating the IRGC and the Quds Force as foreign terrorist organizations. And Mr. Alfana, in your written testimony, you mentioned your colleague, Dr. Ottolenghi, who testified at our Middle East subcommittee on this IRGC issue 2 months ago, and you've both argued that the administration should be reporting on the IRGC in much greater detail, including the subsidiaries of IRGC parent companies, the companies that have an IRGC controlling interest, and the exact nature of the IRGC support to Assad. How effective can our remaining sanctions be if we're not targeting the IRGC subsidiaries and commercial interest? And for Mr. Medell, you highlighted the non-kinetic activities of the Quds Force, including its work in setting up religious organizations, foundations, cultural centers, and testified that progress on U.S. efforts to counter this irregular warfare has been very limited. And as Mr. Duncan continually points out, we've seen a lot of Iranian activity in the Western Hemisphere, throughout the Middle East, to set up these types of influence, destabilization, recruitment centers, but very little effort by us in the United States to counter this. What is Iran's strategic goal in all of this, and where has it been more active, and why have our efforts to counter Iranian influence in this arena been so ineffective? Mr. Alfani.
Thank you. This is a very, very important point that you are raising, Madam. The Revolutionary Guards, of course, is trying to hide its assets. You know, there are so many front companies that the Revolutionary Guards is constantly creating, and therefore the Treasury here in the U.S. must, of course, also be extremely vigilant and be careful that they do not create companies that we are unaware of. One of the good allies of the U.S. in this cat and mouse game, of course, is what remains of the private sector in Iran, because they certainly do believe that the Revolutionary Guards is trying to make their business impossible in Iran. And they also would be willing to cooperate identifying some of those companies of the Revolutionary Guards, which is constantly popping up. And as you also pointed out, many of these activities are going to, the money that flows into Iran goes back to the Revolutionary Guards because of their activities, particularly in the construction sector. Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters of the Revolutionary Guards is the largest contractor in the entire Islamic Republic of Iran. Most of the public projects, development projects in Iran are handed over to the Khatam al-Anbiya construction base on no-bid basis. So the private sector has no say. If they do participate in those projects, it is as subcontractors to the Revolutionary Guards.
Thank you, and I'm going to interrupt you here to give a minute to Mr. Medell.
Thank you for your question. One of the things I think is when you think about the way that Iran externalizes revolution, when you think about when Iran goes into a place like Iraq or Syria or Yemen, anywhere else, there's a lot of building from the ground up. So when I mention religious centers, mosques, cultural centers, and so forth, I think that that's a firm belief that, like Mr. Alfoni suggested, it's more than just about terrorism and subversion. It's about actually altering the fabric of the places where they want to have control and influence in. So when they go and do this, it requires a lot of money. So when you think about the money that it takes to do this, one thing I would mention is a lot of people are speculating as to whether or not the Iranian government is going to take this windfall that it's going to get from sanctions relief and direct it into the IRGC or the MOIS and other security elements of the government. I think, and Mr. Alfoni might be among them, people have written about the fact that after the negotiations began in 2014, the IRGC budget went up. The Ministry of Intelligence budget went up, and this was just in anticipation of sanctions relief. This was publicly stated. This was publicly declared. So I think if you're asking yourself how the Iranians are going to spend the money, they've already been very clear in indicating it. But again, it's not, and I agree with Ambassador Benjamin that it is cheap to pull off a terrorist attack or to do subterfuge, but we're talking about something that's much more transformational than that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Eliana. Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you. Terrorism may be cheap. War is expensive, one of the things that happened just as soon as it was clear to those observing Congress that this deal would go through and Iran would get its hands on $130 billion is Russia deployed forces to Syria. There was like a day between when I concluded, and I watched Congress, that this deal would be implemented, and when Russia began its planning and deployment. I won't ask you, gentlemen, whether there's any proof that Iran is paying some or all of Russia's costs, because my guess is that Iranians don't share that information with you. Ambassador Benjamin, when you say that we're on course to continue our success, you may be out of step with what Americans are seeing and feeling about the Middle East. Mr. Al-Dafi, you say that Iran is moving from a theocracy to a military dictatorship. In a real short answer, can you tell me, is the next generation going to be run by clerics who are true scholars of Islam based in Qum, or are guys with guns going to select the next grand Ayatollah? Yeah.
Thank you for the fantastic question, sir. About the next generation of rulers in Iran, I think that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has committed the worst mistake any civilian politician can make. And it is that he is systematically using the Revolutionary Guards to suppress his domestic opposition. And of course, what happens is that when you invite a military institution, a military organization to participate and intervene in domestic politics, you cannot throw them out again.
Okay.
Because they have guns and you are a civilian, you do not have.
Gotcha. I do want to agree with some that have pointed out the dangers of the Quds Force and the Iranian regime in general. The Shiite alliance has killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people in Syria and killed far more Americans in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Marines in Beirut than ISIS has ever aspired to. The difference is that ISIS, when they kill 50 people, put it on YouTube. When Iranian paid-for barrel bombs kill 1,000 villagers in Syria, Assad has the good taste to deny it. And for that reason, we tend to be focusing on ISIS as the most dangerous enemy. The question I think it was Lennon asked is, what is to be done? You've convinced us that the Guard Force is a bad organization. We still have sanctions that are allowed under the nuclear agreement. Tough sanctions on banks that conduct business on behalf of a company which is designated as a proliferator of WMD, which includes the IRGC, the Quds Force, and many others. And what is often not mentioned is Section 302 that remains in force, that allows that provides for sanctions of those who engage in any significant activity with an IRGC entity. One problem is that we're not applying this to the National Iranian Oil Company, which I think you would agree is heavily involved with the IRGC. I'm going to be distributing to all members of the committee a discussion draft of a statute aimed at the IRGC, and it's going. We now have a menu of sanctions that can be imposed against a bank or a company that does business with the IRGC. It shouldn't be a menu where maybe they just get some parsley, but rather an absolute ban on doing business in the United States, which then can be lifted with specific licenses, so that a company that does any significant business with the IRGC would feel that it's going to lose all access to the U.S. market in doing business in the United States, and then they'd have to go ask the administration for a license to do this or that. And second, in order to avoid neglect of the statute, it would have the GAO give Congress a list of those organizations that appear are most likely to be doing business with the IRGC or its front groups, and those companies would be sanctioned unless the President, with 6 months, came to Congress and said, well, I'm not going to sanction, we shouldn't sanction this one, and we shouldn't sanction that one. So if the administration did what the last 3 administrations have done and just ignore Iran sanctions, those sanctions would go into effect. So I look forward to working with the chairman and all the members and the ranking member on this discussion draft, and we'll also distribute it to our witnesses and ask you to comment on it for the record. I yield back.
And I want to thank Congressman Brad Sherman for that draft, and we will circulate it to all the members of the committee. We go now to Congressman Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing today sort of cements my view that we are entering into a new historic era, and the Cold War is over, and now I think the post-Cold War is coming to a close, and I don't know what we're going to call this new era that we are in. Perhaps history will record it as the era of Islamic terrorism or Islamic resurgence, depending on how we see what unfolds in the next few years. But we are in a different world than we were 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. And I want to thank Chairman Royce. I want to thank Ranking Member Engel. We are facing a whole new era, and they're providing leadership so that we can understand the challenges that we face in this new era. And they both showed a bipartisan spirit and a spirit of getting to the facts, and I appreciate their leadership. Let me ask some specific questions then about knowledge questions. How many of the members does the IRGC have? What are we talking about in Iran? Talking about 50,000 people? What are we talking about there?
Sir, estimates are between 120 and 150,000 active members, active duty members of the Revolutionary Guard.
Are they armed, or are these just others? Are anybody who's in a business owned by them? Or are we talking about the armed people?
These are the armed people, sir, in uniform.
What is the regular army in Iran, and what is its size, and how does it interact with this IRGC?
The regular military is slightly larger, but its bases are alongside the international borders of Iran. And that is because of the constitution of Iran, which gives a different mission to the regular military. The regular military has the mission of protecting the territorial integrity of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The mission of the Revolutionary Guards, according to the constitution, is to protect the revolution and its achievements. It's an abstract.
Does the regular army get along with that? Is there any friction points there?
There are many ideological political commissars in the regular military, which is a classical military organization. It is not ideological.
Which would then be cause friction between the two. In the IRGC, what ethnic makeup is that? We know in Iran about half the people are not Persian, but is the IRGC basically a Persian group, or do they have Kurdish people in it, or Azaris, or Baluch, or Azaris, or whoever? What is the makeup of?
Yes, sir. We do believe that it actually reflects the ethnic composition of Iran as a whole.
So there are Kurds who are
yes, sir.
Members of that as
Shiite
well as
Kurds, yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of the support of the IRGC for terrorism around the world, how many missiles, for example, we have all seen these rockets that go off and are shot by out of Gaza Strip into Israel, and I consider that to be a terrorist act. Anytime you shoot rockets into a country, especially if it's indiscriminately to try to just murder people, I would say that's terrorism. How many of these terrorist rockets that are going into Israel from the Gaza Strip and elsewhere were either manufactured or paid for by the IRGC?
Thank you for the question. I think the vast majority, if not all of them. And not only that, the next generation is actually providing them with the ability to manufacture them themselves.
I didn't catch that last part.
I would say the vast majority have been provided to them by Iran. They're linked to Iranian manufacturers, but what Iran's next phase of support in providing missiles to groups operating in the West Bank and in southern Lebanon is to actually give them the capacity to develop those missiles themselves.
I see, and we might note Congressman Engel and myself, and Ed, I'm not sure Ed was with us on that trip or not, but I remember when we crawled in, we were with us, when we crawled into these tunnels that were dug, and they were not just crawl spaces, these were very expensive construction projects. Are those things being paid for by the IRGC?
You know, from years ago, I can tell you that the intelligence community, I think, was divided on that question. But I think the Iranians were working very closely with Lebanese Hezbollah in developing those tunnels.
So,
but as far as financing goes,
these terrorists, whether they're people who are Palestinians who are conducting terrorism on Israel or these other, they don't have really a large source of money. And what we're talking about when we say financing, this is a vital component to the existence of these terrorists. One last note, Mr. Chairman, and I know my time's running out, is that we have a similar situation from what you described in China, where you have the People's Liberation Army controls and actually receives the profit from a large number of commercial operations. And if people are investing in that and those companies are making a profit, it's going to the People's Liberation Army and not to the people of China. So, go ahead.
I'd just like to make one comment on that. I think you raised a very important point. And if you go back in time to the origin of Lebanese Hezbollah, when Iran was in the early 80s, when Iran was instrumental in figuring out what's the grand vision going to be for this organization, what's their mission going to be, one of the things that took years and years for them to develop was a global commercial apparatus that was composed of businesses, that was composed of a lot of things you just mentioned, and that actually create independent streams of revenue that are off the books. Right. And Iran is doing it, Hezbollah is doing it, and Hezbollah's dependence on Iranian official funds over the years has gone down for that reason.
Thank you.
Yes, you raised the point, Mr. Rohrabacher, on those tunnels and who paid for their construction. I would just make the point, myself and Mr. Engel and Mr. Rohrabacher and Mr. Gregory Meeks were in those tunnels shortly after the Gaza operation, and it was reminiscent to me. In 2006, the Iranian constructed tunnels done for Hezbollah, their engineers were involved in that. We know that from ID badges that were picked up after the 2006 Second Lebanon War. I was there during that conflict. And in this particular case, not only do you have indication that Iran was involved in also the tunnels under Gaza, this particular tunnel that we were in came up underneath a village. And the plan apparently was to capture students because it was a school, it was an elementary school that it was under, and to pull them back into Gaza so that the IDF would have to fight house by house. But the most important point is that after the conflict was over, the report surfaced, which was in the Wall Street Journal, as I recall, in which Iran committed to rebuilding those tunnels that were closed, some 30 plus were discovered, for Hamas. Now, we understand Iran also supports, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In other words, they're not just supporting Hamas in Gaza. They have a secondary organization that they would prefer. But they are providing Hamas. The story also mentioned they committed to providing, again, to resupply the rockets to Hamas. So, it's an on-again, off-again, depending on geopolitics in the area, in terms of how much support they provide Hamas. They clearly would prefer Islamic Jihad as an organization, but I think it's unquestionable that they have been involved in this enterprise, and indeed those reports regularly appear in the media. So I would just, Ambassador, point that out for posterity.
If I may, Chairman Royce, historically there's no question that Iran was a principal sponsor of Hamas, and I believe the exclusive sponsor of Hezbollah. However, I believe the best information we have today is that Iran is not transferring any resources to Hamas now, and Hamas's budget is dependent entirely on its international fundraising efforts, and that includes money that it receives from Qatar and from Turkey, that is to say, from the Sunni side of the equation. And it doesn't appear likely after repeated meetings between Hamas and Saudi Arabia that Iran is going to forgive Hamas it's what it views as treasonous activities. So I think it's important that these distinctions be recognized.
Well, thank you. Hopefully they don't follow through on their commitment to rebuild those tunnels. We'll go then to Albio Series from New Jersey, who's next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. I've been to a number of hearings, and every time I sit here, and sooner or later the comment is made that the Supreme Leader is losing support from the Iranian people. I was just wondering, after the nuclear deal, have the Iranian people lost hope that there could be a change, or has the Supreme Leader solidified his position and have the Revolutionary Guard solidify their positions now that they have a deal and they're going to get all this money? Sir?
Sir, it's an important point that you are making, and a good question. I'm not sure if I know the answer, but I will try my best. Mr. Khamenei needed someone, a technocratic type like Mr. Rouhani, to get people to vote for the regime in order to secure some degree of legitimacy for this regime. And the only reason Mr. Rouhani was elected as president of the republic was because that he promised the Iranian public a nuclear deal with the US. This is why the Iranian people elected him. However, now that he is elected, and now that the nuclear deal is made, Mr. Khamenei no longer needs Mr. Rouhani. He no longer needs the technocratic elites of Iran. So I think the best test is going to be the parliamentary elections of February. Is Mr. Khamenei going to allow Mr. Rouhani and his technocratic elites of Iran to be elected into the parliament, for example? Or is he systematically going to filter every single supporter of Mr. Rouhani among those candidates? And if he does that, and I strongly suspect it is going to happen, then we will see the rise of the Revolutionary Guards and a reaction among the Iranian public, which is one of hopelessness. So in one sense, yes, the Iranian public has lost faith twice. Once during the Green Revolution of 2009, when unfortunately the administration extended a hand of friendship to the regime, to Mr. Khamenei, and not to the Iranian public. And second time, when a nuclear deal was made where the greatest beneficiary is the Revolutionary Guards and not the Iranian public.
Thanks for your question. The only thing I would add to that is I think that there's somewhat of a misconception when you talk about Khamenei as being an all-powerful figure in Iran. I think there's a to a certain degree he is weak in the sense that he's constantly forced to balance conflicting factions of a very, in fact, much more developed series of political factions than when he took over in '89. You've got a much more mature playing field that he has to balance, and he needs the IRGC just as much as the IRGC needs him. So, you know, if Iranians ask themselves, was the election of Rouhani and the JCPOA, do those give us hope or not? I think the Iranians are hopeful. If you look at polls, Iran is hopeful, but they don't equate it to a simple, will Khamenei allow us to continue to have freedoms and advance or not? The Iranians recognize the complexity that Khamenei has to balance, and it's not an easy thing to do. And like Mr. Alfane pointed out, I think next February is going to be very critical in seeing just how much the IRGC has done to actually push back and ensure that, you know, if there's any momentum towards Rouhani, it slows down.
Ambassador?
Both of my colleagues have made very insightful remarks. I would just add that if there is one tried and true pattern in history, it's that the frustration of rising expectations is profoundly dangerous for rulers. And expectations have been raised dramatically in Iran. Rouhani is extremely popular. The notion that Iran is going to have an opening to the West, that the Iranian economy will get a new rush of oxygen, and that they will see greater prosperity, I think is now quite clear. So I think that the supreme leader, you know, has to walk a fine line if he wants to maintain his own standing while not disappointing the expectations of the Iranian people. This brings me back to something actually that Mr. Engel said before about regime change. I think that we found over the last 30 plus years that regime change anywhere in the world is a perilous course of action. And I think that the virtues of the JCPOA have largely been underestimated in terms of creating a 15-year period, which is a significant period of time, in which those expectations can arise, flourish, and shape the course of the Iranian future. To be sure, we have to be vigilant about bad behavior, but I think this is no small achievement, and we can't say for certain that in 15 years Iran will be a more hopeful place, but I think can say with some certainty that without it, we would be facing a very dire situation. And now we've given the Iranian people, you know, some reason to, shall we say, vote with their feet.
Thank you very much. My time is up.
Mr. Matt Salmon.
Thank you. In your view, and this question is to all panel members, is the administration's growing diplomatic outreach to Iran, and some might say acquiescence, particularly considering Iran's support for strife in the region, undermining U.S. credibility in the region? Start with you, Ambassador.
Well, I think it's an interesting and important question. There is no doubt that among our Sunni allies, our Sunni partners, there is significant doubt about this, and they are committed to a policy, by and large, of not talking to Iran, although they do themselves, and of doing everything they can to beat back what they see as the Shia tide. Having said that, it's not entirely clear to me that their perception of what is going on is accurate. You know, the Sunnis are also culpable, it seems to me, particularly the Gulf Sunnis, for the humanitarian catastrophe that is Syria, because they have been pouring more and more resources in at every juncture to try to topple the Assad regime, and there has been very little desire to find an off-ramp there. Similarly, although the Yemen conflict is extremely complicated, what has, I think, been lost sight of is that one of the critical changes was that longtime strongman Ali Abdullah Saleh switched sides, essentially, and tried to relitigate what happened in the Arab Spring and the election of, or the installation of, President Hadi. And so this has been seen as another bit of Iranian perfidy. It's true that we don't like what they're doing with the Houthis, but this has also led, to a campaign against, an outside war against Yemen that has caused another humanitarian catastrophe. So I think that the situation is very complicated. I think, the Israeli government's view was quite clear. But having said that, it's impressive how much of the Israeli defense establishment, I think, has come around to approve of the JCPOA and has been encouraged by the direction things are taking.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears because I have a couple of other questions. I did want to get that one out there, but I have a question for you, Mr. Al-Fana, and then one for you as well, Mr. Modell, if I can just throw them both out. First, to you, you recommend that the U.S. should still pursue the dual goal of toppling Assad regime and fight ISIS at the same time. Even if we're able to topple the Assad regime, which will be increasingly difficult with the overt support of Assad by Russia and the covert support by Iran, what next? And wouldn't the most likely outcome be an Iranian or Russian puppet or a controlled puppet regime? Or perhaps even worse, a fractured, lawless Syria that will give ISIS a larger power base and more territory to control? Is this really the policy that's going to bring stability to the region? And my add-on question to you, Mr. Modell, is very similar. Do you think Iran or ISIS poses the bigger threat to national security, our national security, both in the short and the long term? I'd like your thoughts on that.
Sir, I do believe that one of the reasons that the Alawite elites in Syria are backing Bashar al-Assad is that they have absolutely no alternative as things are right now. If they're given an alternative, if there are security guarantees that there is not going to be a genocide of Alawites after the Sunnis also take part in government, and if a government like the United States is going to give that type of guarantees to the Alawites, why should they stick with someone who has led to destruction of their own countries? I do believe that there is dissatisfaction even among Alawite elites in Syria, but they have honestly nowhere else to go.
As to your question as to what presents a greater short or long-term risk to U.S. national security between Iran and ISIS, I guess it depends. I mean, if you're talking about lone wolf terrorist attacks in the United States or, bombings like 9/11 or the Paris attacks, obviously ISIS. But at the same time, I think if you look at the heart of what Iran is doing, okay, the ideologically driven externalization of its Islamic revolution and everything that represents, if you believe that the vast majority of our allies, our current allies at least in the Gulf and elsewhere, are never going to be okay with that, and they're going to always be opposed to that in a fundamental way, then I think as long as we have a long-term fundamental reason to stay in the Middle East, that's the bigger term threat in terms of creating a permanent destabilizing presence in the region.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, and I think all of us, particularly after reviewing your testimony and several other hearings we've had on this issue, understand that we have to do everything that we can and use all of the tools available to us to keep the pressure on and really help to confront the IRGC and Iran in the region. So my questions are first, To you, Mr. Modell, you said the Obama administration has demonstrated an unwillingness to weaken the IRGC. So I'm asking you what you think the administration should be doing to effectively weaken the IRGC.
One of the things that I mentioned in my recommendations was the fact that the IRGC, if you want to look at one of the things that concerns the IRGC and the Supreme Leader and the conservative establishment in Iran, is the ongoing credibility of the IRGC. The IRGC, we've had one serious kingpin designation against the Iranians, against an IRGC general who was involved in narco trafficking with the Taliban and others. He's based in Baluchistan. And
I have limited time, so could you just tell me what you think we should
recommendations? I think naming and shaming. I think there needs to be a campaign, a media campaign, not covert. I think an open media influence campaign that points out all the things that the IRGC in particular is doing to destabilize the region. I don't think we've done nearly enough of that.
Okay. And with respect to the designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, does anyone on the panel think they don't meet that definition? And if you don't, why not? And what would be the implications of that designation, particularly on Americans being held, but on any other facets of this conflict? Ambassador?
So the designation of the IRGC as a State Department designated foreign terrorist organization would be at odds with the entire history of designations, first of all, in that it would be designating a state organ, a state entity. Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, and as such is covered by a wide raft of different sanctions that are extremely comprehensive. And to add the IRGC to this, it seems to me would add, practically speaking, nothing to our arsenal of tools, nothing meaningful. And what's more is that there remains, in effect, a large array of Treasury designations against the IRGC, as I mentioned before, for terrorism, proliferation, human rights violations. We have all the instruments we need, and I think that to do something additional like this would both be unnecessary from a functional standpoint, and from a signaling standpoint, I'm not sure that it is exactly what we need at precisely the moment that we want to see more. We want to see an effective implementation of the JCPOA.
Well, with respect to that, Ambassador Benjamin, you said in your testimony that additional terrorism campaign or an additional terrorist campaign by Iran would scuttle the agreement, referring to JCPOA. Why do you think that would scuttle the agreement? I don't see anything in the agreement that would, in fact, be in violation if they engage in terrorism. But the argument was made that it's better to confront a non-nuclear Iran than a nuclear Iran, which I agree. And you said the U.S. is in a good position to deter and prevent increased terrorist activity. Through what means? What do you think would be the most effective way for the United States to do that, particularly since I don't think engaging in terrorism is a direct violation of the JCPOA?
I think it's a political matter. If there were a widespread perception that Iran was using this opportunity to carry out a widespread, a massive terror campaign, I think that it would inevitably cause a reaction by Washington. I think that's just pure common sense politics. In terms of being able to deter, let's just break it down, and I'll recap some of my testimony. So Iran has, since 1996, not carried out a terrorist attack against the United States, and has only had one major plot revealed, and that was the very, very strange Arbab-CR plot involving the desire to kill the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. I think that the Iranians have a healthy respect for our counterterrorism capabilities, for our intelligence gathering, and for our law enforcement, and are unwilling to be caught and to risk the kind of global opprobrium that they experienced after the Arbab-CR plot, when there was an overwhelming UN General Assembly resolution condemning them. I do believe that they will continue to try to provoke Israel, and I think that they will try to show that they can do two things at once and that they are still the leaders of the resistance. And I think for that reason, our commitment to Israel's security has to be unwavering. We have to continue funding Iron Dome and continue the very robust support for Israeli defense, intelligence, and counterterrorism activities. And as for how we work with our Arab partners, you know, I think that the solution, the secret of our success has been excellent intelligence. And I think that we should deepen that intelligence cooperation with these countries. But I just note that the circumstances are becoming more difficult as some of these countries are themselves doing things that cross red lines for us, including, for example, their support of extremist groups in Syria. And so to come back to my main theme, we are living in a different Middle East. And I think that we need to think long and hard about what America's role is in the midst of this sectarian conflict.
Thank you, and my time is up. Thank you.
Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Benjamin, I want to go to your statement for just a minute, which I thought was spot on in so many ways. But you say that Iran remains, by a significant margin, the foremost state sponsor of terror today. You go on to talk about Iranian terrorist activity focused primarily on support to groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And then you say roughly 5 years ago, Iran and its proxy Hezbollah appeared to be laying the groundwork for a renewed campaign of terrorism outside of the Middle East. Notable arrests in places like Thailand, Kenya, India, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Bulgaria, and that operatives responsible were traced back to Lebanon and Hezbollah. So we're very familiar with the Iranian-Hezbollah connection. So let's take a moment, and I chair the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. Let's bring this closer to home. January 8 of this year, there was an attempted bombing in Montevideo, Uruguay, that targeted the Israeli embassy. A few days later, an Iranian diplomat, Ahmed Sabitgold, 32, a political consultant at the Iranian embassy, suspected of being involved in placing the explosive device, fled the country. Wasn't expelled, but fled the country. We also know that very close to Uruguay is the tri-border region, which is heavily Lebanese Hezbollah. A lot of financial transactions, other things. You could tie that into the bombings in Buenos Aires. You could go back a long ways, but just keeping it present day, January in Uruguay, and then we had 5 Syrian refugees, migrants, whatever you want to call them, who traveled on fake Israeli passports to, the tri-border region, where they were able to purchase through Hezbollah other fraudulent passports, which turned out to be Greek passports. After traveling a little bit in South America, made their way to Honduras on fake Greek passports. Now, they may have been farmers, may have been student. We don't know what their plans were. But there is a connection between illicit activity in the tri-border region and Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy organization, tied to terrorism all over the globe, not just the ones that I mentioned in Uruguay and Argentina. If you think about what you mentioned in your statement about, and I can't pronounce his name, but the Iranian that was implicated in the assassination attempt of October 2012, is that right? Trying to come across the southern border with the help of the Mexican cartel, and lo and behold, it was a DEA agent. We got lucky. We may not always get lucky. Then you factor in the issue that General Kelly at Southcom brings up, that Iran has opened 80 cultural centers in Latin America in the last, 15 years or less, where there's not really a large Muslim population, okay? So we got tri-border region, Hezbollah. We've got 80 cultural centers in Latin America. We got an attempt by a Quds Force operative to assassinate the Saudi ambassador by coming across our southern border, working with drug cartel. We've got General Kelly pointing out the cultural centers and raising the alarm. So I just want to hear your thoughts on how we combat Iran and the Quds Force here in the Western Hemisphere, knowing all of this. And am I wrong to start raising the flag about this issue? Ambassador.
So Hezbollah has been present in many, many countries around the world since really the 1980s. And their presence is overwhelmingly in the Western Hemisphere and in West Africa, where there are lots of Hezbollah operatives, has been overwhelmingly about economic activity, but we still need to be very vigilant about the possibility that they may seek to get involved in violence. The United States has close liaison relations with most of the countries in the hemisphere and takes the responsibility to surveil these operations very, very seriously. With the exception of Venezuela, I think we've had very good cooperation from most of our partners. And of course, you didn't mention Venezuela, which has been a subject of concern regarding Hezbollah, in particular Iran, for many years. And I think that, this is the world we live in. I have written and said on many times that we need to continue our investments in intelligence and in law enforcement and work with these countries to ensure that we have tabs on everyone who is doing everything, and then to prompt them when the time comes to take legal action or to expel these people. And on many occasions, they have done so. I actually think that the level of Hezbollah infrastructure, and I haven't had an intelligence community assessment on this in some time, and I'm no longer in the government, but I think the level of Hezbollah infrastructure is somewhat diminished from what it was in, say, the 1990s. And that we have had some really impressive successes against Hezbollah. For example, the case involving the Lebanese Canadian Bank, which led to the forfeiture of, I believe, $140 million in assets, including the uncovering of this large-scale operation that involved sending used cars to West Africa, in which, from the Western Hemisphere, where they were then sold across Africa, and the profits were mingled with Hezbollah drug money, for example, and then passed on to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So we can't eliminate all of these bad actors everywhere at once, but I think that we have shown over time that we have a very, very capable intelligence community, and our legats around the world are working very, very hard, our FBI representatives. And I think that we continue this to keep the pressure on the group. Right now, it is a group that is somewhat stretched by its involvement in Syria, and a group that I think wants to avoid being embroiled in an even wider conflict than the one it is. So it's, for example, being careful vis-a-vis Israel. But, at the State Department, when I was coordinator, we kept a very close eye on this, and were in touch with our colleagues around the world whenever we felt there was a need, and I think that we can continue those policies to curb Hezbollah activity. I believe you have to go back to the bombings in Argentina to find any violent activity in this hemisphere by Hezbollah.
Well, for your information, for the record, the State Department now doesn't take the Iranian activity, Hezbollah's activity in the Western Hemisphere, much of a threat. And I've got the report that shows they did a very poor job in evaluating that. So,
well, I think, so I'd have to go back and look at the country reports or anything that they've submitted to you. I think that it is probably justified to say that the threat level is low, but that the economic activity remains a matter of concern. Compared to the Sunni threat, compared to ISIS, compared to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, I think that the threat from Hezbollah to Americans specifically is quite low.
Yeah, I'm out of time. I appreciate your frankness. Now yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. We go now to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. And, Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this hearing and giving us the opportunity to be reminded of Iran's support for terrorism and the actions of the IRGC in particular. And I'd like to focus in on one part of the JCPOA that we've touched on briefly, but I really want to understand better. We're moving forward under this deal, and there is a long list of individuals and entities who will see sanctions relief under the JCPOA coming off of, the sanctions coming off are nuclear proliferation sanctions. This hearing is about Iran's support for terrorism, and we know that under existing law, individuals and entities can and should be sanctioned for their support for terrorism and for violation of human rights. So the question for all three of you is, shouldn't we, in advance of providing any sanctions relief to those individuals or entities for proliferation sanctions, shouldn't we go through all of them, determine which ones should still be sanctioned for their support for terrorism, and never let them off to begin with?
Sir, I think in this context, we need to distinguish between U.S. sanctions and EU sanctions, because what we see is that most of actually every single individual and entity owned or connected by the Revolutionary Guards still remains sanctioned by the U.S. government. But when it comes to the European sanctions regime, they are going to remove actually most of the Revolutionary Guards units and personnel 8 years from the time of the implementation day. So the Europeans 8 years from now may be engaging in business with
I understand that, Mr. Al-Fahmi, but I'm focused on those individuals and entities who will get sanctions relief when sanctions relief is initially granted, not 8 years from now, but when they meet their nuclear-related obligations. And from everything that I've read, everyone will acknowledge that some of them are on that list. Some may be on there and are on there dual sanctioned for proliferation and for terrorism, but there are others who are on the list because it's easier to put them on the list for proliferation than it would have been to prove their support for terrorism. But if we're serious about stopping Iran from supporting terrorism, have any of you looked at that list and identified the individuals and entities who support terrorism and who should not be considered for sanctions relief at all? Mr. Modell?
Let me just say, one of the recommendations I made the last time I testified, which addressed the same question, was Treasury, which does a lot of great work. One of the things they and when asked by me directly to some people over there, have you ever undertaken a comprehensive study to look at all the people who have been sanctioned and designated on the SDN lists, where they are today, where they are now, how have they been impacted, are they still in business, how are they subverting sanctions, so forth? And the answer is they're poorly resourced. That's a different issue. But the answer, I think, to your question is yes, they should, because a number of the people that are coming off the list, and I've seen a few that I'm thinking of in particular, were part of what is nothing short of a global transnational organized crime effort on the part of Iran. And in this case, it was to circumvent sanctions and nuclear-related issues. But those people were willing to commit crimes on behalf of the Iranian government then. Now that you're taking them off the list, they're not going to stop being part of this global apparatus that's involved in the illicit procurement activities.
Right. And Ambassador Benjamin, there was a statement within the past few weeks from the Supreme Leader who said, I think it was the Supreme Leader, who said that any effort to reimpose sanctions will be a violation of the deal. But clearly that wouldn't be a violation of the deal. The terror-related sanctions were never meant to be a part of the deal. That's what we were told throughout. That's clearly the view of this committee, of the administration. So shouldn't we be, before granting sanctions relief, shouldn't we be pushing back to disabuse anyone in Iran of the notion that lifting of sanctions for nuclear proliferation means lifting of sanctions altogether?
Well, I think your point is well taken. I think that the administration has been doing that pretty clearly in statements by the President, Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, and the like. No one has been, to my mind, delisted for terrorism activities. If anything, everyone has been reaffirming that Iran is and will remain designated as a state sponsor. I cannot really say anything informed about the listings that Treasury has on individuals for terrorism, but I've certainly never heard that there have been people listed under proliferation because it was easier to do that than to do them for reasons of terrorism. Obviously, these lists should be scrubbed regularly. There are issues of resources, but I think we just continue to repeat the message over and over again that bad behavior absolutely will not be tolerated.
Right. I understand, but Ambassador Benjamin, shouldn't we scrub that list now before sanctions relief is granted to any of those individuals or entities to make sure that if someone on that list has been supporting terrorism and is and should be subject to sanctions, that they continue to be subject to sanctions, and they never come off that list.
I think that's self-evident. I think that if you find people who are sanctionable because of terrorist activity, they should be sanctioned. And we've made it clear that we will do that. We did it before, and we should do it again.
And we should do it before there's sanctions relief granted. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. McCall.
I think the chairman.
That sounds nice, Mr. McCall. We have a good chairman.
Yes, we do. Let me just add, in 2012, the Obama administration basically admitted that the IRGC was one of the most powerful economic actors within Iran, that they own a network of front companies all over the world, essentially. And so while they claim that upon implementation day that the sanctions will still be in place on the IRGC, wouldn't these front companies that are owned by the IRGC benefit, and therefore wouldn't the IRGC benefit directly from the lifting of these sanctions? I'll start with you, Mr. Oliphant.
Yes, sir. To the extent that the Revolutionary Guards manages to establish new front companies, it would, of course, benefit, by sanction evasion from the United States, but it would also most directly benefit from the sanctions relief, because the Iranian government is funding the Revolutionary Guards' engagement in the economy of Iran. Even during the presidency of Mr. Rouhani, who certainly does not seem to be a fan of the Revolutionary Guards, there seems to be more Revolutionary Guards participation in development of Iran's economy, in many public projects which have been granted to the Revolutionary Guards. And I also think that this is the miscalculation of President Rouhani. He thought that he could buy and bribe the Revolutionary Guards not to oppose the nuclear deal. But what of course will happen now is that the Revolutionary Guards takes the money and they will oppose the nuclear deal during the implementation phase.
That's interesting. Mr. Modell? I'm sorry, let's go down the, okay, Ambassador.
I would just point out that there's sort of this belief that we're headed into a completely binary change. And the fact is, as I think has been well demonstrated over the years, the threat of Treasury sanctions is an enormous threat and a big hammer. We have unilateral sanctions remaining on lots of IRGC entities, and I think that the likelihood that foreign investors, of course, no Americans will be investing because of the retention of our sanctions, but the likelihood that, say, European or Asian investors are going to suddenly strike deals with these entities, if there is any shadow hanging over them, is quite limited, because in the end, the U.S. is still going to be prepared to cut those companies off from credit markets. And our ability to do so is quite remarkable. So yes, in theory, there is a danger there, and it's one we need to be vigilant about. But the Treasury has never been particularly shy about sharing information about those connections, and I expect they'll be very aggressive in the future, too.
And maybe, Mr. Modell, I'll let you comment. And I just throw out the last question because my time is running out, and that is, there's been some discussion that under the Section 219 of the Immigration Nationality Act that the IRGC should qualify as a foreign terrorist organization. I think that would give complete certainty that the lifting of sanctions would not benefit the IRGC, but I'd throw that out to you.
One of the things I want to mention on your front company question before was that when you look at the ability of, and this is based on my own experience, but the experience in talking to people who are serving, U.S. government officials serving in the region now, when they approach our allies, particularly in the Southern Gulf, and ask for cooperation on trying to dismantle front companies, try to get more cooperation in working against front companies, working closely with the financial intelligence units to learn more about how they're moving men and money and material throughout the region, a lot of walls are put up. And I think if you're going to get serious about it, you need to go to the places like the Emirates, where there are hundreds and hundreds of companies that are springing up all the time that are in very few ways deterred by any sanctions that have been going on. So that's something I think needs to be
It's
addressed.
a great point. What about the designation as a foreign terrorist organization? Would you agree that they should be?
You know, I just think it's so intertwined. I appreciate the Ambassador Benjamin's point earlier that it would go against historical precedent, but I think when you look at the way the dimensions of the IRGC and how interwoven they are with regard to a singular mission that happens to overlap with terrorism and a lot of the illicit activities you do around the world, I just don't know how you're going to deter them otherwise. And I think the one point that needs to be made is the Iranians have been very clear in saying, maybe not explicitly, but their main goal has always been to get rid of European sanctions. That's how it was before 2012. They were perfectly fine to live with a comprehensive trade ban. They can survive with it or without it. So I think if you're going to get, it's worth exploring that if you did do that, you would have an extra deterrent for Europeans to do business with them, and that might be an extra way of prodding them to change their behavior.
Mr. Alfanay, do you have any opinion on that?
My organization agrees with Mr. Model's suggestion that the entire organization should be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. I have a slightly different approach in this regard because I would like to punish those entities of the Revolutionary Guards which take part in the war in Syria, and we can document their presence in Syria. And the difference, I think, hopefully, and both our methods, I think, have their own, merits, but I also believe that my approach would have the added value of starting a process and a discussion, hopefully, within the Revolutionary Guards. So they try to understand the price that they are paying for supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime and keeping on his throne of blood.
And Ambassador, I presume you would be opposed to that designation?
Yes, I did summarize my reasons before. Again, it would be, on the one hand, a complete break with our tradition of how we do foreign terrorist organizations. We have never designated at the State Department a government organ, and I think that actually the existing sanctions under the designation of Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, as well as the whole array of other executive order, treasury designations and the like are more than ample currently certainly for enforcement purposes, and I don't see any additional messaging purpose that would be fulfilled through this.
Yeah, I see my time has expired.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion, and I have some very, I'll say, simplistic questions. First of all, in terms of, we've been saying IRGC, and then we're talking about Iran. For the funding of Hezbollah, is it the IRGC that funds Hezbollah, or is it Iran, or is it both? I don't, how does that exchange happen?
I only do my analysis, in open source, so it's very difficult for me to give you a precise answer. But the way that it operates is usually indirect. So the Iranian government, in the old days, in the 1980s, for example, they would, on the national budget, tell the entire world that Iran is supporting, let's say, Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah, and with so and so many millions of dollars. But then in mid-1980s, there were several lawsuits against the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the US because there were victims and family members of victims of terrorism who could refer to the national budget of the Islamic Republic of Iran and prove that Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. So ever since the mid-1980s, the Islamic Republic has been trying to hide the mechanisms through which they send money to Hezbollah. So we do not have open source information available for you. But some of that money is through Revolutionary Guards. Some of that money is through the Office of the Supreme Leader. Some of that money is through the cultural centers. Even the construction base of the Revolutionary Guards, Khatam al-Anbiya, is engaged in housing projects in Lebanon, particularly after the 2006 war. So there are multiple channels through which the Islamic Republic is funding Hezbollah.
Did you want to answer? Because I have a couple of questions.
I would just say very quickly, I think it's a kind of distinction without a difference. Hezbollah is funded because it's a national priority of the government of Iran.
Okay. So my next question really has to do with, I guess, the relativity of Hezbollah's efforts in the Middle East towards the conflict. If Hezbollah was not present in Syria, how much difference do you think that would make?
The Bashar regime would have collapsed because the Islamic Republic was not ready a few years ago to deploy large-scale forces of the Revolutionary Guards in Syria. Hezbollah has been doing the job of the Revolutionary Guards and seems also to have been suffering a large number of casualties. My study of the Iranian casualties shows me that since January 2012, 201 Iranians have been killed in combat in Syria. The number for Lebanese fighters, Hezbollah fighters in Syria in the same period of time seems to be above 1,000, possibly 1,500.
So does anyone else want to take a stab at that? So let me say, if Hezbollah was removed, or let me put it this way, if Hezbollah was not being funded by Iran, would there be more likely a collapse of the Assad regime?
I think I would only say, and we're in a very hypothetical world here,
yes,
that it's kind of hard to imagine what that world would be like, because Iran's interest in Syria is above all about the resupply and the connection with Hezbollah. So, you know, we'd be taking the heart out of the jigsaw puzzle.
No. The reason I guess, well, my motive for asking that question is because I think a lot of us were concerned with this Iran agreement because we saw a direct connection between Iran getting money, more money, funding Hezbollah, and creating this horrible conflict in Syria. So I mean, I'm not that. So, but let me just ask another question, if I could follow up. If Iran was not funding Hezbollah, what would you think would be the effect on peace in Israel?
Again, that's a big hypothetical, but let me make a couple of comments on the Iran-Hezbollah relationship, the way I've seen it evolve, particularly since 2012. Point number one is when sanctions really started to hit, okay, entire operational units of the IRGC itself where their funding levels went down. Their activities, as a result, went down. And not only the IRGC, but Hezbollah as well, and other groups that were on the receiving end of Iranian government funding also were put on hold. So when the JPOA, before the JCPOA took place, and the Iranians were feeling the brunt of this pain of sanctions, their operational activity did decline. And but I would also say that Hezbollah has evolved into its own organization. It has its own identity, and to a certain extent, by Hezbollah over the last decade, if not more, Hezbollah has developed its own ways of generating revenue. They don't depend entirely on Iran as they did in the earliest years of the revolution.
Okay, well, that was really what my question was. So you are saying now that,
and my answer,
well, what would you say percentage-wise of their own funding versus relying on Iran?
For the open source, I cannot give you a precise estimate, madam, unfortunately.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more. I think it's like, well, the three of us are left here. We've had so many different meetings in the last month or 2 months or whatever, or the year, about what's going on in Syria. In your opinion, will the IRGC be okay with a transition out of Assad?
The clear answer is no, madam. They have invested in the person of Bashar al-Assad. All the commanders, senior commanders of the Revolutionary Guards have supported Bashar al-Assad personally in the Iranian press. It would be a terrible loss of face for them, but there seems to be discussions within the regime. So the president of Iran, President Rouhani, he has sent some signals which we could interpret as some degree of readiness to cooperate with someone else, than Bashar al-Assad. But that is not the signals we hear from the Revolutionary Guards.
Anybody else?
I would just say that, it's very hard to conceive of any Iranian acquiescence in a peace plan that involved both the removal of Assad and his non-replacement by one of his inner circle Alawite senior leaders. I think that is that's kind of a non-starter for the Iranians, even if they do come to the conclusion that the person himself does not have to stay there forever.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Kurt Clausen from Florida.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ambassador Benjamin, you have stated that the administration will still be able to rely on UN Security Council resolutions that levy arms embargoes against key areas of concern such as Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and in folks in Houthis in Yemen. Now, Iran does billions of dollars with trade with the Gulf states. They do billions with Europe. No one's going to stop that unless it's us. I mean, I don't know all the different lists, this list, that list, the other list, the Treasury Department, but I know everybody's doing business with everybody. And if we were serious and we really wanted to stop it, we could stop it. Last time I checked, we were almost a third of the global GDP. Our trade deficit is $40 billion a month. And a lot of that goes to the people that we would need to cooperate with us from Europe and from that region. And no one can survive without our financial system. No one. If we wanted to stop Iranians enriching themselves, we wouldn't be talking about lists and we wouldn't be talking about the UN. We'd just say, hey, anybody doing business with y'all can't do business with us, and that's going to shut your economy down. And anybody taking their money can't do business with our banks, and that would shut their financial access down. It seems to me that this is just some sort of economic charade. I wouldn't depend on the UN to shut down the money into Iran. We have a third of the global GDP. Why would we go to the Security Council? If we wanted to stop these folks from getting guns to point at Israel and to point at our allies, we ought to get serious about economic sanctions and economic leverage that we have. And it just always makes me irate when we go through these lists when we just allow everyone to trade with these folks. You know we do. You know we do. Are we ever going to get serious about stopping the trade? Because if we wanted to, we're the only folks. Now, I know Russia won't, but our friends in Europe trade with them, and so do folks in the region. And we all know it. We just allow it to happen. Are you going to tell me they're not doing trade or that we couldn't stop them? What are you going to tell me here?
Well, first of all, your point about America's economic power, I think, are largely on point. And it was because we exercised that economic power that we got the Iranians to the table to negotiate over their nuclear program. What I said about and what I have testified about the Security Council resolutions is that they give us the authority under international law to stop certain kinds of trade. So, for example, as I mentioned before, weapons from Iran designated for the Houthis in Yemen were seized on the high seas because we had the right under a Security Council resolution.
But my question, Ambassador, is why would we outsource our economic leverage to someone else? We have the largest market in the world. I don't want to ask permission from somebody else to use my market access as leverage. We will only get a fraction of our leverage. You're saying that we're making progress by using the UN and all these things that you're talking about today. It may be a little bit, but why wouldn't we use the full force of our financial system and the full force of our market leverage with everyone that does business with Iran? Because I don't think the UN uses the full force of our economic leverage due to our market capacity.
I'm not sure, sir, to what end you want to use all that for.
To keep Israel safe and our friends from getting killed and thousands or millions of refugees. That's what I'd like to use it for.
Well, I think that, history has shown that a mixture of different instruments, diplomacy, sanctions, military pressure, and the like, are the way to go. When we have tried in the past to have far-ranging secondary sanctions, we have had some success, but we also have encountered some very, very serious resentment from our allies, and it puts us in a very difficult position when we want to get other things from them as well. So the policymaker's job is to mix the different instruments in a way that produce the desired effect. I think that our European friends, if we suggested we cut off all trade, would say that's fine for you, but not fine for us.
And you know what, I would say that if they wanted to do business in our big box retailers, which they all do, they may not like it, but they'll go along. Do any the other two of y'all have anything to add on what my point is? Am I off point here in any way, or am I wrong? Am I overstating the case of American power and economic leverage? I don't think you're overstating the economic leverage we have. I just think we've taken a dramatic shift to doing things in the way that Ambassador Benjamin has laid out, in a multilateral sense, and we're not making
Well,
unilateral.
it's not working.
We're not.
It's not working.
Until the Europeans see that doing business with Iran is not in their interests, and we can't convince them otherwise. I don't see any way how it's going to go otherwise. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought I would return just with the panel here to a couple of news reports from April of this year. One includes a report from Israel's Security Service publishing details of information on Hamas's preparation for war with respect to new tunnels being dug, and said that the Security Service said they had obtained from a Hamas fighter and a tunnel digger arrested in that month. He had provided a wealth of information on the terror group's tunnel digging in the Gaza Strip, as well as its methods for obtaining cash from Iran for the purpose of digging those tunnels. Iranian support, according to the report, came in the form of cash, advanced weapons, and sophisticated electronic equipment meant to interfere with control signals for drones over the coastal enclave. So, and then the second report in the Wall Street Journal, according to a senior Western intelligence official, Iran's Revolutionary Guards during the last few months have transferred tens of millions of dollars to Hamas's brigades. Intelligence reports show that the funds have been transferred on the direct orders of General Soleimani, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards elite Quds force, who also directs the annual budget to finance Hamas's military operation. The funds, according to the intelligence reports, are being used primarily to help Hamas rebuild the network of tunnels that were destroyed during the Israeli Defense Forces' response to rocket attacks launched by Hamas militants from Gaza last summer. So at least the one or two intelligence agencies have a different assessment. Just for the record, since we had a dialogue on that, Ambassador, I raise that point again.
So I would just say that those reports, there were signs of a rapprochement. Hamas was expelled from Tehran some years ago. There were signs of a rapprochement earlier this year. I believe that rapprochement didn't happen during the summer because of Hamas's extensive meetings with the Saudis. But I am relying here on open source, and I strongly recommend that you request a briefing from the CIA on the subject.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate the testimony of all of our witnesses here today. And so with that, we'll stand adjourned.